Good afternoon. Welcome to the second in the series of Charles E. Test, M.D., 2006 Visiting Scholar Seminars with our special guest, Dr. Leon Kass, M.D., speaking on the general topic, Keeping Life Human, Biology, and Human Dignity. I bring you greetings from Professor George and Professor Wilson, neither of whom can be with us this afternoon and who very much regret their absence. My name is William Allen. I'm a visiting fellow this year in the James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions, and I'm pleased to serve as your host for the afternoon. We will have, of course, not only today's lecture, which is the second, but a third lecture tomorrow. And we've begun a journey, the end of which, of course, we cannot foretell, but we can already see from the experiences we've had that it is worth the taking. So we want to move readily into this afternoon's discussion, and I will pause only to introduce you to Mr. Sharif Gargas, who is a junior fellow in the Madison program and who will man or person the microphone for this afternoon. Now, of course, for those of you who were not with us, it's still material to know that Leon Kass served 2 years as chairman of the President's Council on Bioethics, and under his leadership, the council published 6 major books and a white paper on topics ranging from human cloning and human dignity to ethical caregiving in our aging society. In 2003, he was one of 4 inaugural recipients of the Bradley Prize. Dr. Kass is married 45 years, to Amy Apfel Kass, whom we're delighted to have with us as well. Leon R. Kass is the Addie Clark Harding Professor in the Committee on Social Thought at the college at the University of Chicago, and the Hertog Fellow in Social Thought at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a native of Chicago, was educated at the University of Chicago, earning a BS and MD degrees, and also at Harvard, where he took the Ph.D. in biochemistry. Afterwards, he did research in molecular biology at the National Institutes of Health while serving in the United States Public Health Service. He shifted directions from doing science to thinking about science's human meaning and has been engaged for over 35 years with ethical and philosophical issues raised by biomedical advance and more recently with broader moral and cultural issues. He's published numerous books and articles. He's taught at several institutions, including St. John's College at the University of Chicago. I'm not going to read you the entire list. Suffice to say, it has been my good fortune to have taught from Leon Kass's writings and to have found students who found those writings very helpful in thinking through the fundamental questions which it concerns us to deliberate this week. And therefore, it's with great pleasure that I invite him once again to open those deliberations. And before he comes up, I will say I just turned my cell phone off. Leon.
Thanks very much, Professor Allen, and thanks once again to all of you for coming out and participating in this discussion this afternoon. Can I be heard on top? No. I'll try to get this a little closer. There's a lot of equipment here, lights, papers, microphone. If you can't hear me on top as I'm going along, just raise your hand and I'll try to mumble a little less. Better? Good, thank you. The title of today's talk is The Dignity of Human Being, Death with Dignity and the Sanctity of Life. Yesterday, in the first of these test lectures, I offered an overview of the promise of modern biomedical science, and especially the perils we face from looking to this science for our salvation. I identified three major dangers. First, the threat to human equality and even human life from a negative eugenic campaign against genetic deficiencies and other human imperfections. Second, the threat to human excellence and true human flourishing from a positive campaign to perfect our nature and enhance our activities biotechnologically. And third, the threat to human self-understanding from the ideology of soulless scientism, the belief that the truth about human life can be given only in scientific and material terms. In each case, I suggested, what hangs in the balance is human dignity, the equal dignity of human being that belongs to each of us throughout our lives by virtue of our common membership in the human species, the elevated dignity of being human that belongs to us when we are actively at our best by virtue of our virtuous activity, and the psychic dignity of human self-esteem that belongs to all of us whenever we recognize ourselves as creatures of freedom and responsibility by virtue of our special standing in the world. In this lecture, I wish to explore and defend the foundational equal dignity of human being, seen through the prism of issues surrounding death and dying. What do death and dying mean for human dignity? How do we protect and defend our dignity as our lives come to an end? Some thinkers regard death as the ultimate indignity because our extinction is a refutation of our claims to special worthiness. Others, perhaps uncommitted on that question, nonetheless view the process of dying as an assault on human dignity insofar as dying progressively wipes out our special powers and standing. In response to these alleged indignities, some people are asserting the right to assisted suicide and euthanasia to enable people to exit life by choice in an arguably more dignified way before they sink further into decay and degradation. Others oppose such practices, asserting that such direct assaults on human life are in fact incompatible with the equal dignity and respect that is owed to human life at whatever stage or condition of existence. Life, they insist, has intrinsic sanctity and dignity and must not be violated. Before attempting to sort out these claims and counterclaims, we must take stock of the context in which these debates are occurring. Call no man happy until he's dead. So did the ancient Athenian sage Solon remind the self-satisfied Croesus of the perils of fortune and the need to see the end of a life before pronouncing on its happiness. Even the richest man on earth has little control over his fate. The unpredictability of human life is an old story. Many a once flourishing life has ended in years of debility, dependence, and disgrace. But today the problems of the ends of lives are more acute and more widespread, a consequence, ironically, of successful or partly successful human efforts to do battle with fortune, and in particular to roll back medically the causes of death. While many look forward to further triumphs in the war against mortality, others here and now want to exercise greater control over the end of life by electing death to avoid the burdens of lingering on. The failures resulting from the fight against fate are to be resolved by taking fate still further into our own hands. This is no joking matter, nor are the questions it raises academic. They emerge insistently and urgently from poignant human situations occurring daily in hospitals and nursing homes as patients and families and physicians are compelled to decide matters of life and death, often in the face only of unattractive, even horrible alternatives. Shall I allow the doctors to put a feeding tube into my 85-year-old mother who is unable to swallow as a result of a stroke? Now that it is inserted and she is not recovering, may I have it removed? When would it be right to remove a respirator, forego renal dialysis, bypass life-saving surgery, or omit giving antibiotics for pneumonia? When in the course of my own progressive dementia will it be right for my children to put me into a home or for me to ask my doctor or my wife or my daughter for a lethal injection? When, if ever, should I as a physician or husband or son accede to or be forgiven for acceding to such a request? These dilemmas can be multiplied indefinitely, and their human significance is hard to capture in words. Speech does not begin to convey the anguish and heartache felt by those who concretely confront such terrible decisions, nor can it do much to aid and comfort them. Moreover, any generalized discussion necessarily abstracts from the special and concrete features of each human situation. No amount of philosophizing and no law or social policy is going to substitute for discernment, compassion, courage, sobriety, tact, thoughtfulness, or prudence, all needed on the spot. Yet the attitudes, sentiments, and judgments of human agents on the spot are influenced, often unwittingly, by speech and opinion and by the terms in which we formulate our concerns. Some speech may illuminate, other speech may distort, some terms may be more or less appropriate to the matter at hand. About death and dying, once subjects treated with decorous or superstitious silence, there is today an abundance of talk, not to say indecorous chatter. Moreover, this talk frequently proceeds under the aegis of certain increasingly accepted terminologies, which are, in my view, both questionable in themselves and dangerous in their influence. As a result, we may be producing a recipe for disaster. Urgent difficulties, great human anguish, and high emotions stirred up with inadequate thinking. We have no choice but to reflect on our speech and our terminology. And so this afternoon I wish to explore the relation between two powerful notions, both prominent in the discussions regarding the end of life: death with dignity and the sanctity or dignity of life. Both convey elevated, indeed lofty ideas. Each phrase often functions as a slogan or a rallying cry, though seldom with any regard for its meaning or ground. In the current debates about assisted suicide and euthanasia, we are often told that these notions pull in opposite directions. Upholding death with dignity might mean taking actions that would seem to deny the sanctity of life. Conversely, unswervingly upholding the sanctity of life might mean denying to some a dignified death. This implied opposition is for many of us very disquieting. The dilemmas themselves are bad enough. Much worse is it to contemplate that human dignity and sanctity might be opposed and that we may be forced to choose between them. The confrontation between upholders of death with dignity and upholders of the sanctity of life is in fact nothing new. 3 decades ago, the contest was over termination of treatment and letting die. Today, the issue is the right to die and assisted suicide. Tomorrow, it might be the duty to die and mercy killing, so-called active euthanasia. On the extremes of both battles stand the same opponents, many of whom, I think mistakenly, think the issues are the same. Many who now oppose mercy killing or voluntary euthanasia then oppose termination of treatment, thinking it equivalent to killing. Those who today back assisted suicide and mercy killing, in fact, agree. If it's permissible to choose death by letting die, they argue, why not also by active steps to hasten humanely the desired death? Failing to distinguish between letting die and making dead, by failing to distinguish between intentions and motives, causes and results, goals and outcomes, both sides polarize the debate, opposing not only one another, but also those in the uncomfortable middle. For them, it is either sanctity of life or death with dignity. One must choose. I do not accept this polarization. Indeed, in this lecture, I mean to suggest that the very opposite is true. Human dignity and sanctity of life are not only compatible, but if rightly understood, they go hand in hand. Moreover, death with dignity, rightly understood, has largely to do with exercising and supporting the humanity that life makes possible, often to the very end, and very little to do with medical procedures or the causes of death. I will also suggest that the sanctity and dignity of life is entirely compatible with letting die, but not with deliberately killing. The practices of euthanasia and assisted suicide do not conduce to human dignity, and our rush to embrace them will only accelerate the various tendencies in our society that undermine not only dignified conduct, but even decent human relations. This last paragraph is, in a way, the synopsis of the argument as a whole, which from here proceeds in three parts, the first part of which is called the sanctity of life and human dignity. What exactly is meant by the sanctity of life? This turns out to be difficult to say. In the strictest sense, sanctity of life would mean that life is in itself something holy, transcendent, set apart, like God himself. Or again, to begin with our responses to the sacred, it would mean that life is something before which we should stand with reverence, awe, and grave respect, because it is beyond us and unfathomable. In more practical terms, to regard life as sacred means that it should not be violated, opposed, or destroyed, and more positively, that it should be protected, defended, and preserved. Despite their differences, these various formulations agree in this, that sacredness, whatever it is, inheres in life itself, and that life by its very being calls forth an appropriate human response, whether of veneration or restraint. To say that sacredness is something that can be conferred or ascribed or removed by solely human agreement or decision is to miss the point entirely. What is the ground of life's sanctity? Does it depend decisively on a divine act, either that life was made by God or that he later sanctified it as he did the Sabbath? Or, quite apart from its origins, is there perhaps something God-like about human life, for example, spirit, that deserves awe and respect, and before which we stand somewhat as we should before the divine? More experientially, leaving all revelation to the side, is there not something proto-religious in the joy of birth, in the horror of extinction, and in many of the astonishing appearances and doings of all living things, before which the proper response is wondering awe? What is it that makes what kind of life sacred? To the best of my knowledge, the phrase sanctity of life does not occur either in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament. Life as such is not said to be holy, kadosh, as is, for example, the Sabbath. True, traditional Judaism places great emphasis on preserving human life. Even the holy Sabbath may be violated to save a life, implying to some that a human life is more to be revered than the Sabbath. Yet the duty to preserve one's life is not unconditional. To cite only one example, a Jew should accept martyrdom rather than commit idolatry, adultery, or murder. As murder would appear to be the most direct assault on human life and the most explicit denial of its sanctity, perhaps we gain some access to the meaning of the sanctity of life by thinking about why murder is proscribed. If we could uncover the ground of restraint against murder, perhaps we could learn something of the nature of the sanctity of life, and perhaps too of its relation to human dignity. As a result, we might be in a better position to consider the propriety of letting die, of euthanasia and assisted suicide, and of other activities sometimes embraced by the adherents of death with dignity. So, why is killing another human being wrong? Can the prospective victim's request to be killed nullify the wrongness of such killing, or what's more, make such killing right? Alternatively, are there specifiable states or condition of a human being's life that would justify or excuse someone else's directly and intentionally putting him to death, even without request? The first question asks about murder. The second and third ask whether assisting suicide or mercy killing can and should be morally distinguished from murder. The answers regarding assisted suicide and euthanasia will depend in part on the answer regarding murder, that is, on the reasons why it is wrong. Why is murder wrong? The laws against murder are, of course, socially useful. Civil society is possible only because people generally accept and abide by the reasonableness of this rule. In exchange for society's protection of one's own life against those who might otherwise take it away, each member of society sacrifices in principle his natural right to the lives of all others. Civil society requires peace, and civil peace depends absolutely on the widespread adherence to the maxim, "Thou shalt not murder." This usefulness of the taboo against murder is sometimes offered as the basis of its goodness. Killing is bad. Why? Because it makes life unsafe and society impossible. But this alone cannot account for the taboo against murder. In fact, the goodness of civil society is itself predicated upon the goodness of human life, which society is instituted to defend and foster. Civil society exists to defend the goods implicit in the taboo against murder, at least as much as the taboo against murder is useful in preserving civil society. However valuable any life may be to the society, each life is preeminently valued by the person whose life it is. Individuals strive to stay alive, both consciously and unconsciously. The living body, quite on its own, bends every effort to maintain its living existence. The built-in impulses towards self-preservation and individual well-being that penetrate our consciousness, say as hunger or fear of death, are manifestations of a deep-seated and powerful will to live. These thoughts might suggest that murder is wrong because it opposes this will to live, because it deprives another of life against his will, because it kills someone who does not want to die. This sort of reason would explain why suicide, self-willed self-killing, might be right, while murder, killing an innocent person against his will, would always be wrong. Let's consider this view more closely. Certainly there are some invasions or violations of another's body that are made innocent by consent. Blows struck in a boxing match or on the football field do not constitute assault. Conversely, an unwelcome kiss from a stranger, because it is an unconsented touching, constitutes a battery actionable at law. In these cases, the willingness or unwillingness of the victim alone determines the rightness or wrongness of the bodily blows. If consent excuses or even justifies these attacks on the body of another, might not consent excuse or justify a lethal attack, turning murder into merely unwrongful homicide? A person can be murdered on this account only if he personally does not want to be dead. There's something obviously troubling about this approach to crimes against persons. Indeed, the most abominable practices prescribed in virtually all societies are not excused by consent. Incest, even between consenting adults, is still incest. Cannibalism would not become merely delicatessen if the victim clearly gave permission. Ownership of human beings voluntarily accepted would still be slavery. The violation of the other is independent of the state of the will, in fact, of both the victim and the perpetrator. The question can be put this way: is the life of another human being to be respected only because that person or society deems or wills it respectable? Or is it to be respected rather because it is in itself respectable? If the former, then human worth depends solely on human agreement or will, and since will confers dignity, will can take it away, and permission to violate nullifies the violation. If the latter, then one can never be released from the obligation to respect human life by a respect to do so, say from someone who no longer values his own life. This latter view squares best with our intuitions. We are not entitled to dismember the corpse of a suicide who did not wish to live, nor may we kill innocently those who are consumed by self-hatred. According to our law, killing the willing, the unwilling, and the non-willing, for example, infants and comatose people, are all equally murder. Beneath the human will, indeed the ground of human will, is something that commands respect and restraint willy-nilly. We are to abstain from killing because of something respectable about human being as such. But what is it? In Western societies, moral notions trace back to biblical religion. The bedrock of Jewish and Christian morality is the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not murder, the sixth commandment, heads up the so-called second table, which enunciates duties towards one's fellow man. From this fact, some people have argued that murder is wrong solely because God said so. After all, that he had to legislate against it might imply that human beings on their own did not know that it was bad or wrong. And even were they to intuit that murder is wrong, they might never be able to answer our question if challenged, why is it wrong? Thus, so the argument goes, God's will supplies the missing reason for the human rule. This argument is finally not satisfactory. True, divine authority elevates the standing and force of the commandments, but it does not follow that they make sense only because God willed them. Pagans yesterday believed, and atheists today still believe, that murder is wrong. All other cultures and non-religious thinkers line up squarely against murder. Aristotle, who did not know the biblical God, spoke for rationality himself when he said the very name murder, like adultery and theft, implies badness. In fact, the entire second table of the Decalogue is said to propound not so much divine law, but natural law, law suitable for man as man, not only for Jew or Christian. The Bible itself could be said to provide evidence in support of this interpretation, at least about murder. In reporting the first murder committed by Cain upon his brother Abel, before there was any given or known law against it, Abel's blood is said to cry out from the earth in protest against his brother's deed. The crime, it seems, was a crime against blood and life, not against will, human or divine. And Cain's denial of knowledge, "Am I my brother's keeper?" seems a clear indication of guilt. For if there were nothing wrong with murder, why hide one's responsibility? A proto-religious dread accompanies this encounter with death, especially violent death. But the best evidence comes shortly afterward in the story of the covenant with Noah. The first law against murder is explicitly promulgated for all humankind united well before there are Jews or Christians or Muslims. The passage is worth looking at in some detail because, unlike the enunciation of the sixth commandment in Exodus, here we get a specific reason for why murder is wrong, one that, as I will argue, is philosophically defensible. The prohibition of murder, or to be more precise, the institution of retribution for shedding human blood, is part of the new order following the flood. Before the flood, human beings lived in the absence of law or civil society. The result appears to be something like what Hobbes called the state of nature, characterized by a condition of the war of each against all. Might alone makes right, and no one is safe. The flood washes out human life in its natural state. And immediately after the flood, some form of law and justice is instituted, and nascent civil society is founded. At the forefront of the new order is a newly articulated respect for human life, expressed in the announcement of the punishment for homicide. I quote, it's Genesis 9:6. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God was man made. Like law in general, this cardinal law combines speech and force. The threat of capital punishment stands as a deterrent to murder and hence provides a motive for obedience. But the measure of the punishment is instructive. By equating a life for a life, no more than a life for a life, and the life only of the murderer, not also, for example, of his wife and children, the threatened punishment implicitly teaches the equal worth of each human life. Such equality can be grounded only in the recognized equal humanity of each human being. Against our own native self-preference and against our tendency to overvalue what is our own, blood for blood conveys the message of universality and equality. But murder is to be avoided not only to avoid the punishment. That may be a motive which speaks to our fears, but there is also a reason which speaks to our minds and our loftier sentiments. The fundamental reason that makes murder wrong and that even justifies punishing it homicidally is man's divine-like nature, image of God, divine-like. Not the other fellow's unwillingness to be killed, not even or only our desire to avoid sharing his fate, but his, any human being's very being requires that we respect his life. Human life is to be respected more than animal life because man is more than an animal. Man is said to be God-like. Please note, and it would take me a lot more time, I think, to make the definitive case, but I'm going to argue that the truth of this biblical assertion does not rest on biblical authority. Man's more than animal status is in fact performatively proved whenever human beings quit the state of nature and set up life under law. This, by the way, is in Genesis 1, the reader is told that man is created in God's image. The first human being to be told that man is in God's image is Noah. And that moment when the human being somehow discovers that he is godlike is the very time when he exercises his godlikeness in establishing life under law, the first law of which is to is to protect and defend the sanctity of life. The law that establishes that men are to be law-abiding both insists on and thereby at once demonstrates the truth of the superiority of the human. Man is godlike precisely insofar as he affirms and defends the godlike being of every human being. How else is man godlike? Genesis 1, where it is first said that man is created in God's image, introduces us to several divine activities and powers. 1, God speaks, commands, names, and blesses. 2, God makes and makes freely. 3, God looks at and beholds the world. 4, God is concerned with the goodness and the perfection of things. 5, God addresses solicitously other living creatures. In short, God exercises speech and reason, freedom in doing and making, and the powers of contemplation, judgment, and care. Doubters may wonder whether this is truly the case about God. After all, it is only on biblical authority that we would regard God as possessing these powers and activities. But it is indubitably clear, even to atheists, that we human beings have them, and that they lift us above the plane of a merely animal existence. Human beings alone among the earthly creatures speak, plan, create, contemplate, and judge. Human beings alone among the creatures can articulate a future goal and bring it into being by their own purposive conduct. Human beings alone among the creatures can think about the whole, marvel at its many splendored forms in articulated order, wonder about its beginning, and feel awe in beholding its grandeur and pondering the mystery of its source. Finally, a complimentary and preeminently moral gloss on the image of God is provided quite explicitly in Genesis 3 at the end of the so-called second creation story. Now the man has become like one of us, knowing good and bad, not the fall of man, but the rise of man to this divine-like knowledge. Human beings, unlike the other animals, distinguish good and bad, have opinions and care about their difference, and constitute their whole life in the light of this distinction. Animals may suffer good and bad, but they have no notion of either. Indeed, the very pronouncement, murder is bad, constitutes proof of this godlike quality of human beings. In sum, man has special standing because he shares in reason, freedom, judgment, and moral concern, and as a result lives a life freighted with moral self-consciousness. Speech and freedom are used, among other things, to promulgate moral rules and to pass moral judgments, first among which is that manslaughter is to be punished in kind because it violates the dignity of such a moral being. We note a crucial implication. To put it very simply, the sanctity of human life rests absolutely on the dignity, the God-likeness of human beings. Yet man is at most only godly. He is not God or a God. To be an image is by definition also to be different from that of which one is an image. Man is at most a mere likeness of divinity. With us, the seemingly godly powers and concerns described above occur conjoined with our animality. We are also flesh and blood, no less than the other animals. In our case, God-likeness is tied to blood, which is the life. The point is crucial, and once again it stands apart from the text which is taught it to us. Everything high about human life, thinking, judging, loving, willing, and acting, depends absolutely on everything low: metabolism, digestion, respiration, circulation, excretion. In the case of human beings, divinity needs blood or mere life to sustain itself. Yet because of what it holds up, human blood, that is, human life, deserves special respect beyond what is owed to life as such. In our case, the low ceases to be the low. The biblical text elegantly mirrors this truth about its subject, subtly merging both the high and the low. Notice, though the reason that's given for punishing murder concerns man's godliness, the injunction itself concerns man's blood. Respect the godlike, don't shed its blood. Respect for anything human, Pache philosophers of personhood and autonomy, requires respecting everything human, requires respecting human being as such. Human existence is itself the bearer of a foundational and irreducible dignity. We have found, I believe, what we were searching for, a reason immanent in the nature of things for finding fault with violating human life, apart from the needs of society, the will of the victim, or even the will of God. The wanton spilling of human blood is a violation and a desecration not only of our laws and wills, but of being itself. And we have also found the ground for repudiating the opposition between the sanctity of life and human dignity. Each rests on the other, or rather they are mutually implicated, as inseparable as the concave and the convex. Those who seek to pull them apart, I submit, also engaged in wanton, albeit intellectual, violence. Unfortunately, the matter cannot simply rest here. Though the principle seems well established, there is a difficulty raised, in fact, by the text itself. How can one assert the inviolability of human life and in the same breath insist that human beings deliberately take life to punish those who shed human blood? There are, it seems, sometimes good reasons for shedding human blood, notwithstanding that man is in God's image. We have admitted the dangerous principle. Humanity, to uphold the dignity of the human, must sometimes shed human blood. Bringing this new complication to the case of assisted suicide or euthanasia, we face the following challenge to the prior and more fundamental principle, shed no human blood. What are we to think when the continuing circulation of human blood no longer holds up anything very high, when it holds up little more or even no more than metabolism, digestion, respiration, circulation, and excretion? What if human godliness appears to be humiliated by the degradation of Alzheimer's disease or paraplegia or rampant malignancy? And what if it is the well-considered aspiration of the godlike to put an end to the humiliation of that very godliness, to halt the mockery that various severe debilities make of a fully human life? Do these situations provide other exceptions to our rule against manslaughter, in which the dignity of a human life can only be respected by ending it? The first thing to observe, of course, is that the cases of capital punishment and euthanasia or suicide are vastly different. One cannot, by an act of euthanasia, deter or correct or obtain justice from the violator of human dignity. Unlike murder, senility and terminal illness are of natural order and can be blamed on no human agent. To be precise, these evils may, in their result, undermine human dignity, but lacking malevolent intention cannot be said to insult or deny it. They are reasons for sadness, not indignation, unless one believes, as the tyrant does, that the cosmos owes him good and not evil and exists to satisfy his every wish. Moreover, one does not come to the defense of diminished human dignity by finishing the job, by annihilating the victims. Human dignity would no more be vindicated by euthanizing patients with Alzheimer's disease than it would be by executing as polluted the victims of rape. Nevertheless, the question persists, and an affirmative answer remains the point of departure for the active euthanasia movement. Many who fly the banner of death with dignity insist that it centrally includes the option of active euthanasia, especially when requested. In order to respond to this challenge, we need, therefore, a more careful inquiry into death with dignity, the subject of Part 2. The phrase death with dignity, whatever it means precisely, certainly implies that there are more and less dignified ways to die. The demand for death with dignity arises only because more and more people are encountering in others and fearing for themselves or their loved ones the deaths of the less dignified sort. The point is indisputable. The possibility of dying with dignity can be diminished or undermined by many things. For example, by coma or senility or madness, by unbearable pain or extensive paralysis, by isolation or rejection, by institutionalization or destitution, by sudden death, as well as by excessive or impersonal medical interventions directed toward the postponement of death. It is the impediments connected with modern medicine that increasingly arouse indignation, and the demand for death with dignity pleads for the removal of these unnatural obstacles. More generally, the demand for autonomy and the cry for dignity are asserted against the medicalization and institutionalization of the end of life that robs the old and the incurable of most of their autonomy and dignity. Intubated and electrified with bizarre mechanical companions, confined and immobile, helpless and regimented, once proud and independent people find themselves cast in the roles of passive, obedient, highly disciplined children. Death with dignity means, in the first instance, the removal of these added indignities and dehumanizations of the end of life. One can only sympathize with this concern. Yet even if successful, efforts to remove these obstacles would not yet produce a death with dignity. For one thing, not all obstacles to dignity are artificially and externally imposed. Infirmity and incompetence, dementia and immobility, all of them of natural origins, greatly limit human possibility, and for many of us they will sooner or later be unavoidable, the products of inevitable bodily or mentally decay. Second, there is nothing of human dignity in the process of dying itself, only in the way we face it. At its best, death with complete dignity will always be compromised by extinction of dignified humanity. It is, I suspect, a death-denying culture's anger about dying and mortality altogether that expresses itself in the partly oxymoronic and unreasonable demand for dignity in death. Third, insofar as we seek better health and longer life, insofar as we turn to doctors to help us get better, we necessarily and voluntarily compromise our dignity. Being a patient rather than an agent is, humanly speaking, undignified. All people, especially the old, willingly, if unknowingly, accept a whole stable of indignities simply by seeking medical assistance. The really proud people refuse altogether to submit to doctors and hospitals. A death with positive dignity, which may turn out to be something rare, like a life with full human dignity, entails more than the absence of external indignities. Dignity in the face of death cannot be given or conferred from the outside, but requires a dignity of soul in the human being who faces it. True, the possibility of a humanly dignified facing of death can be destroyed or undermined from without, but the actualization of that possibility depends largely on the soul, the character, the bearing of the dying person himself, that is, on the things within. To understand the meaning of and prospects for death with dignity, a little more discussion about dignity itself is necessary, what it is. Dignity is, to begin with, an undemocratic idea. The central notion, etymologically, both in English and in its Latin root dignitas, is that of worthiness, elevation, honor, nobility, height, in short, of excellence or virtue. In all its meanings, it is a term of distinction. Dignity is not something which, like a nose or a navel, is to be expected or found in every living human being. Dignity is, in principle, aristocratic. But we can, of course, seek to democratize the principle. One can argue that excellence, being worthy, is a property of all human beings, say, for example, in comparison with animals or plants or with machines. This is, in fact, what is often meant by human dignity. It is also what is implied when it is asserted that much of the terminal treatment of dying patients is dehumanizing, or that attachments to catheters, respirators, and suction tubes hide the human countenance and thereby insult the dignity of the dying. Yet to speak of dignity as predicable of all human beings, say in contrast with animals, would seem to tie dignity to those distinctively human features of human animals, such as the powers of thought and image-making, freedom and choice, love and friendship, the sense of beauty and the moral life, and not the mere presence of life itself. Among human beings, there would still be, on any such material principles, distinctions to be made. If universal human dignity is grounded, for example, in the moral life, in that everyone makes and faces and makes moral choices, dignity would seem to depend mainly on having a good moral life, that is, on choosing well. For is there not more dignity in the courageous than in the cowardly, in the moderate than in the self-indulgent, in the righteous than in the wicked? Nevertheless, without abandoning the connections between dignity and excellence, we must observe that courage, moderation, righteousness, and the other human virtues are in fact not solely confined to the few. Many of us strive for them with partial success, and still more of us do ourselves honor when we recognize and admire those people nobler and finer than ourselves. With proper models, proper rearing, and proper encouragement, many of us can be and act more in accord with our higher natures. In these ways, the openness to dignity can be democratized still further. In truth, if we know how to look, we find evidence of human dignity all around us, in the valiant efforts ordinary people make to meet necessity, to combat adversity and disappointment, to provide for their children, to care for their parents, to help their neighbors, to serve their country. Life provides numerous hard occasions that call for endurance and equanimity, generosity and kindness, courage and self-command. Adversity sometimes brings out the best in a man and often shows best what he is made of. Confronting our own death or the deaths of our beloved ones provides an opportunity for the exercise of our humanity for the great and small alike. Death with dignity in its most important sense would mean a dignified attitude and virtuous conduct in the face of death. What would such a dignified facing of death require? First of all, it would seem to require knowing that one is dying. One cannot attempt to settle accounts, make arrangements, complete projects, keep promises, or say farewell if one does not know the score. Second, it requires that one remain to some degree an agent rather than merely a patient. One cannot make a good end of one's life if one is simply buffeted about by forces beyond one's control, if one is denied a decisive share in decisions about medical treatments, institutionalization, and the way to spend one's remaining time. Third, it requires the upkeep as much as possible of one's familial, social, and professional relationships and activities. One cannot function as an actor if one has been swept off the stage and been abandoned by the rest of the cast. It would also seem to require some direct self-conscious confrontation in the loneliness of one's own soul with the brute fact and meaning of nearing one's end. Even or especially as he must be passive to the forces of decay, the dignified human being can preserve and reaffirm his humanity by seeing clearly and without illusion. And it is for this reason, among others, that sudden and unexpected death, however painless, robs a man of the opportunity to have a dignified end. But as a human life is not just a lonely project against an inevitable death, but a life whose meaning is entwined in human relationships, we must stress for the importance for a death with dignity, as for a life with dignity, of worthy human intercourse with those around us. Who we are to ourselves is largely inseparable from who we are to and for others. Thus, our own exercise of dignified humanity will depend crucially on continuing to receive respectful treatment from others. The manner in which we are dressed, what is said to us in our presence, how our bodies are tended or our feelings regarded, in all these ways, our dignity in dying can be nurtured and sustained or undermined. Dying people are all too easily reduced ahead of time to thinghood by those who cannot bear to deal with the suffering or disability of those they love. Yet this withdrawal of contact, affection, and care is probably the greatest single cause of the dehumanization of dying. Death with dignity requires absolutely that the survivors treat the human being at all times, and no matter how diminished, as if full godlikeness remains up to the very end. It will, I hope, now be perfectly clear that death with dignity, understood as living dignifiedly in the face of death, is not a matter of pulling plugs or taking poison. To speak this way, and it is unfortunately common to speak this way, is to shrink still further the notion of human dignity, and thus heap still greater indignity upon the dying, beyond all the insults of illness and the medicalized bureaucratization of the end of life. If it is really death with dignity we are after, we must think in human and not technical terms. With these thoughts firmly in mind, we can turn in closing back to the matter of euthanasia. Part 3, euthanasia, undignified and dangerous. Having followed the argument to this point, even a friendly listener might chide me as follows. Well and good, Kass, to think humanistically, but tough practical dilemmas arise precisely about the use of techniques, and they must be addressed. Not everyone is so fortunate as to be able to die at home in the company of loving family, beyond the long reach of the medical-industrial complex. How should these technical decisions about respirators and antibiotics and feeding tubes, and yes, even poison, be made, precisely in order to uphold human dignity and the sanctity of life you say are so intermingled? A fair question, and I offer the following outline of an answer. About the treatment for the actually dying, there is in principle no difficulty. Elsewhere, I have argued for the primacy of easing pain and suffering, along with supporting and comforting speech, and more to the point, the need to draw back from some efforts of prolongation of life that prolong or increase only the patient's pain, discomfort, and suffering. Although I am mindful of the dangers and aware of the impossibility of writing explicit rules for easing treatment, hence the need for prudence, not, please note, living wills, considerations of the individual's health, activity, and state of mind must enter into decisions of whether and how vigorously to treat if the decision is indeed to be for the patient's good. Ceasing treatment and allowing death to occur when and if it will can under some circumstances be quite compatible with the respect that life itself commands for itself. For life can be revered not only in its preservation, but also in the manner in which we allow and enable a given life to reach its terminus. But what about so-called active euthanasia, the direct making dead of someone who is not yet dying or not dying fast enough? Elsewhere, I have argued at great length against the practice of assisted suicide and euthanasia by physicians, partly on the grounds of bad social consequences, but mainly on the grounds that killing patients, even those who asked for death, violates the inner meaning of the art of healing. Powerful prudential arguments, unanswerable in my view, have been advanced as to why legalized mercy killing would be a disastrous social policy, at least for the United States. But some will insist that we cannot remain deaf to cries for human dignity and that dangers must be run to preserve a dignified death through euthanasia, at least where it is requested. So let's look more closely at voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide and their relation to human dignity. Proponents of assistance in dying claim that a choice for death, because it is a free act, affirms the dignity of free will against dumb necessity. Is it not precisely dignified, they insist, for the godlike being to voluntarily put an end to the humiliation that his continued existence opposes on that very godliness? But the people who are actually contemplating euthanasia for themselves, as opposed to their proxies who lead the euthanasia movement, rarely put their requests in those terms. They are in fact looking for a way to end their troubles and pains. One can sympathize with such a motive out of compassion, but can one admire it out of respect? Is it really dignified to seek to escape from troubles for oneself? Is there not, to repeat, more dignity and courage than its absence? Euthanasia for one's own dignity is at best paradoxical, even self-contradictory. How can I honor myself by making myself nothing? Even if human dignity were to consist solely in autonomy, is it not an embarrassment to claim that autonomy reaches its zenith precisely by a choice that makes it disappear? Voluntary euthanasia and assisted suicide in the name of positive dignity does not make sense. Acknowledging the paradox, some still argue the cause of freedom on a more narrow ground. The prospect, rather than the act of euthanasia, increases human freedom by increasing options. It is, of course, a long question whether human freedom is best served through the increase of possibilities. But in the present case, I am certain that this view is mistaken. On the contrary, the opening up of an option for assisted suicide will greatly constrain human choice. For the choice for death is not one equal option among many, but an option to end all options. Socially, there will be enormous pressure on the aged and the vulnerability to exercise this option. Once there looms the legal alternative of euthanasia, it will plague and burden every decision made by any seriously ill elderly person, not to speak of their more powerful caretakers, even without the subtle hints and pressures applied to them by others. And by the way, thinking about the others, is it dignified to ask or demand that someone else become my killer? It may be said that one is unable to end one's own life, but can it conduce to either party's dignity to make the request. Consider its double meaning if made to a son or daughter. Do you love me so little as to force me to live on? Do you love me so little as to want me dead? What person in full possession of their own dignity would inflict such questions on anyone they loved? Of course, the whole thing could be made impersonal. No requests to family members, only to physicians. But precisely the same point applies. How can one demand care and humanity from one's physician and at the same time demand that he play the role of the technical dispenser of death? And to turn the matter over to non-physicians, that is to technically competent professional euthanizers, is of course to completely dehumanize the matter. Proponents of euthanasia do not understand human dignity, which at best they confuse with humaneness. One of their favorite arguments, in fact, proves this point. Why, they say, do we put animals out of their misery but insist on compelling fellow human beings to suffer to the bitter end? Why, if it is not a contradiction for the veterinarian, does the medical ethic absolutely rule out mercy killing? Is this not simply inhumane? Perhaps inhumane, but not thereby inhuman. On the contrary, it is precisely because animals are not human that we must treat them merely humanely. We put dumb animals to sleep because they do not know that they are dying, because they can make nothing of their misery or mortality, and therefore because they cannot live deliberately, that is humanly, in the face of their own suffering or dying. They cannot live out a fitting end. Compassion for their weakness and dumbness is our only appropriate emotion, and given our responsibility for their care and well-being, we do the only humane thing we can. But when a conscious human being asks us for death, by that very request, he displays the presence of something that precludes our regarding him as a dumb animal. Humanity is owed humanity, not humaneness. Human dignity is owed the bolstering of the human, even or especially in its dying moments, in resistance to the temptation to ignore its presence in the sight of suffering. What humanity needs most in the face of evils is courage, the ability to stand against fear and pain and thoughts of nothingness. The deaths we most admire are those of people who, knowing that they are dying, face the fact frontally and act accordingly. They set their affairs in order, they arrange what could be final meetings with their loved ones, and yet with strength of soul and a small reservoir of hope, they continue to live and work and love as much as they can for as long as they can. Because such conclusions of life require courage, they call for our encouragement and for the many small speeches and deeds that shore up the human spirit against despair and defeat. And what of non-voluntary euthanasia for those too disabled to request it for themselves, the comatose, the senile, the psychotic? Can this be said to be in the service of their human dignity? If dignity is, as the autonomy people say, tied crucially to consciousness and will, non-voluntary or proxy voluntary euthanasia can never be a dignified act for the one euthanized. Indeed, it is precisely the decline of dignified humanity that invites the thought of active euthanasia in the first place. But consider further, is it really true that such people are beneath all human dignity? Many people in greatly reduced states still retain clear, even if partial, participation in human relations. They may respond to kind words or familiar music. They may keep up pride in their appearance or in the achievements of the grandchildren. They may take pleasure in reminiscence or simply in having someone who cares enough to be present. Conversely, they may be irritated or hurt or sad, even appropriately so. And even nearer the bottom, they may be able to return a smile or a glance in response to a drink of water or a change of bedding or a bath. Because we really do not know their inner life, what they feel and understand, we run the risk of robbing them of opportunities for dignity by treating them as if they had none. It does not follow from the fact that we would never willingly trade places with them that they have nothing left worth respecting. But what finally about the very bottom of the line, say people in a persistent vegetative state, unresponsive, contorted, with no evident ability to interact with the environment? What human dignity remains here? Why should we not treat such human beings as we properly treat dumb animals and put them out of their misery? Misery, by the way, is probably what they don't have. They have a degraded condition. I grant that one faces here the hardest case for the argument I have been advancing. And yet one probably cannot be absolutely sure, even here, about the complete absence of inner life or awareness of their surroundings. There was a paper in Science just in the last month or two in which they did brain flow studies by asking a PVS patient to imagine playing tennis, and to everyone's astonishment, some kind of mental activity was evidenced for. In some cases, admittedly rare, persons recover from profound coma, and they sometimes report having had partial yet vivid awareness of what was said and done to them, though they had given no external evidence of same. But beyond any restraint owing to this ignorance, I would myself also be restrained by the human form, by human blood, and what I owe to the full human life that this particular instance of humanity once lived. I would gladly stand aside and let die, say in the advent of pneumonia, once known as the old man's friend. I would do little beyond the minimum to sustain life, but I would not countenance to give a lethal injection or take other actions deliberately intending the patient's death. Between what are only undignified courses of action, this strikes me as the least undignified, especially for myself. Indulge me a few more minutes, I'm coming close to the end. The analysis I have offered will, I am sure, strike some defenders of the dignity of human existence as insufficiently vigorous on the side of life, precisely because I would be willing to stand aside and let nature take its course, say when patients in a persistent vegetative state get pneumonia. These moralists would sanction withholding such life-sustaining treatment only if the treatment itself is too burdensome or useless. They will never allow considerations of the character of the patient's existence to enter into a decision of how vigorously to treat. I understand and fully sympathize with the principle that we never declare another person's existence to be unworthy of life. That was the burden of my starting point yesterday. At the same time, however, we must not allow medical progress to convert every available non-burdensome medical intervention into a moral obligation always to use it. And we should avoid becoming complicit in keeping patients on the rack in agony or extreme degradation simply because we have the means to keep them alive. There is such a thing as a time to die, and doctors and family caregivers are not respecting the dignity of the dying if they are always opposing death's timeliness. In making such heartrending decisions, as I stressed at the outset, there can be no fixed rules of conduct. Nothing can take the place of the need for loving prudence on the spot, informed to be sure by a commitment to respect the dignity of human life to its very last breath. I have no illusions that it is easy to live with a Karen Ann Quinlan or a Nancy Cruzan or a Terry Schiavo. I think I sufficiently appreciate the anguish of their spouses, their parents, and their children, and the distortion of their lives and the lives of their families. I also know that when hearts break and people can stand it no longer, mercy killing will happen, and I think we should be prepared to excuse it, as we generally do when it occurs in this way. But excuse is not yet justification, and very far from dignity. What then should we conclude? We should reject the counsel of those who, seeking to drive a wedge between human dignity and the sanctity of life, argue that the need for active euthanasia and assisted suicide, especially in the name of death with dignity. For it is precisely the setting of fixed limits on violating the dignity of embodied human life itself that makes possible all our other efforts at dignified relations with our fellow men, especially when their neediness and disability try our patience. We will never be able to relate even decently to people if we are entitled always to consider that one option before us is to make them dead. Thus, when the advocates for euthanasia press us with the most heartrending cases, we should be sympathetic but firm. Our response should be neither, yes, for mercy's sake, nor murder, unthinkable, but sorry, no. Above all, we must not allow ourselves to become self-deceived. We must never seek to relieve our own frustrations and bitterness over the lingering deaths of others by pretending that we can kill them to sustain their dignity. The ancient Greeks knew about hubris and its tragic fate. We modern rationalists do not. We do not yet understand that the project for the conquest of death leads only to dehumanization, that any attempt to regain the tree of eternal life by means of the tree of knowledge leads inevitably to the hemlock, and that the utter rationalization of life under the banner of the will gives rise to a world in which the victors would live long enough to finish life demented and without choice. The human curse is to discover only too late the evils latent in acquiring the goods we wish for. Against the background of enormous medical success, terminal illness and incurable disease appear as failures and as affronts to human pride. We refuse to be caught resourceless. Thus, having adopted a largely technical approach to human life and having medicalized so much of the end of life, we now seem to be willing to contemplate a final technical solution for the evil of human finitude and for our own technical but unavoidable failure, as well as for the degradations of life that are the unintended consequences of our technical successes. This is dangerous folly. People who care for autonomy and human dignity should try rather to reverse this dehumanization of the last stages of life, instead of giving dehumanization its final triumph by welcoming the desperate goodbye to all that contained in one final plea for poison. Last paragraph. The present crisis that leads some people to press for assisted suicide and active euthanasia is really an opportunity to learn the limits of the medicalization of life and death and to recover an appreciation of living with and against mortality. It is an opportunity to remember and affirm that there remains a residual human wholeness, however precarious, that can be cared for even in the face of incurable and terminal illness. Should we cave in, should we choose to become technical dispensers of death, we will not only be abandoning our loved ones and our duty to care, we will exacerbate the worst tendencies of modern life, embracing technicism and so-called humaneness, when encouragement and humanity are both required and sorely lacking. On the other hand, should we hold fast, should we decline the ethics of choice and its deadly options, should we learn that finitude is no disgrace and that human dignity can be cared for to the very end, we may yet be able to stem the rising tide that threatens permanently to submerge the best hopes for human dignity. Thank you for your patience and attention.
It is custom and command that as we enter the discussion period, students have first opportunity. Dr. Kass will moderate the discussion himself. So students, if you will begin.
Was that student here yesterday who wanted a non-religious argument? Or if she was satisfied? Well, not today. Please. Would you stand and would you
please use the microphone for the purpose of the recording? Thank you.
So under the framework that you've presented for human dignity, you mentioned this before, but how can capital punishment be, how can you excuse capital punishment?
How could this be compatible with...
I'm really confused at that.
Yeah, I think there are a number of ways to try to think about it. One of them would be to say that someone who rationally understood the inviolability of human life and who nonetheless violated, in effect denied his or her own claim to be one amongst us. And I think Kant would be a perfectly good teacher in this subject, that if I were a rational being who, alas, committed a murder, I ought myself to be in favor of this as the measured, fitting response to what I had done. In other words, I had pulled the ground from under my own existence and wrote myself out of the community that exists precisely to defend that principle. death to murderers, not to their families, but that, and by the way, I would, one should never say never. Murder is not, I think, in my horoscope. Being a victim is a possibility, but it's not, can't imagine it's in the realm of possibility. If I should commit a murder, I would expect, and I think, given what I think, expect my life to be taken. Now, I'm not sure, if you take the biblical context in which that kind of teaching is presented, it comes against the background of the war of each against all, and in passages which one would have to discuss at length and to fill out the argument, that law requiring the retribution. By the way, let me add just a further point on that side. One of the ways you could argue the meaning of that remark, man is the godlike being, is that he precisely takes into his own hands the responsibility for dispensing justice. That until this particular point, when things got miserable, God wiped everything out in the violence before the flood. But what it really means, in fact, to exercise that kind of responsibility is to have this awesome and miserable power. And that's not to say, that doesn't finish the subject. There is still the question of the blood on the hands of the executioners and whether that's somehow good for them. But on the question of the justice of it, I think one could defend it. The background is, of course, God starts over after the flood and tries to create a new world order with Noah, who happens to be the first person born into the world after Adam dies. There are 9 generations alive at one time. Noah is born, and Adam drops dead of natural causes, and the world goes nuts. And you have a kind of mini Iliad with the heroes and the men of renown, and there's slaughter, and even the animals are corrupted. And God starts over, and he starts with Noah, who somehow has known death and didn't go crazy. And it's to be a peaceful order in which the lion and the lamb broke straw together. They get off the ark, and without instruction, what does Noah do? He builds an altar and offers up some of his animal relations. And God smells the sweet savor, and he says, "Never again will I curse the ground for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth." God's pronouncement on the animal sacrifice of Noah is that even Noah, who was on the ark with his animal roommates, has got a lust for blood. So the dispensation, I know that this will bother certain people in the House, but the Noahide code is in a way of separating the human from the animal, a separation which has been anticipated from before. A certain concession to meat eating is offered, but not the blood, which is the life, recognizing that even that is a kind of transgression. It's a kind of transgression. And you might argue that capital punishment is a primitive condition necessary for human bloody-mindedness, and to restrain that bloody-mindedness to no more than a life for a life, and that later on, homicide is not enough to justify capital punishment. There has to be, foreknowledge, intention, and those kinds of things enter. And maybe, although the Old Testament is filled with very, very harsh sort of statements of punishments, the rabbis always moderated them. They moderated them in the direction of a certain kind of mercy. But I think strict moralism would say a life for a life and no more than a life for a life is what I would willingly sign up for if I entered the social contract and took up my membership as a person in that community. And that, in a way, does honor to me as the perpetrator as a deed. It doesn't treat me as being in the grip of forces beyond my control.
I have a follow-up question to your response. As someone who has committed murder, that they've given up their claim to dignity. So what would you say to
they haven't given up their claim to dignity. It's precisely the dignity that they have as being responsible for their actions that mean they should be willing to embrace the punishment.
So then in a similar manner, someone who is dying and has this similar mindset of, it is okay to kill me, like homicide is okay, then I'm not exactly sure why you wouldn't perceive them in the same way, that in a way they sort of deserve death as well, or it's justifiable at least.
Forgive me, but I don't think I grasped. Let me just ask you to repeat. I interrupted you and got lost in the train of your own thoughts.
It's
so
okay.
If you come back again.
So I guess I'm seeing it more of as a mindset, that if someone who commits homicide, that their mindset in a way allows for the justification of their own death, in the way that they view dignity itself. And I feel like, at least in my mind, that someone who is dying has that same sort of mindset, and that homicide is okay right now.
No, I'm sorry, and I've obviously jumped in with both feet into something that has to be disentangled slowly. I used the example of how the murderer, were he to be rational about it, could accede to the rightness of his own punishment, that was somehow what was tacit in his joining the community in the first place. I don't say that he forfeits his dignity by committing a murder. In fact, I treat that person, by treating him as responsible for his conduct, I give him what he deserves, and if he's not only to stand responsibly for his conduct, but to understand himself as responsible, he might even agree with the justice of what this has done. Whether it should be moderated for other reasons we could discuss later. The person who is dying that's an innocent life. There is no act of, you do not somehow erase the violation of life that Alzheimer's disease is by eliminating the bearer of that life. You see what I'm saying? You can't sort of complete the degradation by extinguishing it.
I guess I just see it differently in that the mindset is similar. I see the mindset as being similar. That in the one case, obviously, a dying person is not actually committing the act of homicide. But his mindset is that it is okay to commit the act of homicide in this situation.
You mean on himself?
Yes. And so for me, that in itself, sort of going with your argument, that in itself, that mindset is what allows for the justification of his death.
Yeah.
That in itself is dignity.
I could understand. I can understand why someone might wish to escape from their troubles. I think there are noble circumstances, noble occasions of suicide. It would be a long discussion. There are Roman examples, there are Stoic examples, and you have to have a heart of stone not to somehow see something of the nobility there. The question is, how do you begin to describe and justify that? It seems to me the escape from one's troubles, that's intelligible. To say that that we are somehow demonstrating our dignity by putting an end to its very ground is paradoxical, to say the least. How could an act of freedom that destroyed freedom be its prime manifestation? So you'd have to give a kind of justification for this, not in terms of the dignity of autonomy, but in terms of something like, I'm a dumb animal, please treat me like a dumb animal. And I say to you, if you ask me to treat you like a dumb animal, the very request proves to me that you're not, and I won't do it. The really difficult case, I think, is the one at the very bottom, where what you have is a spontaneously breathing, otherwise, it's the embodiment of a life that has been, but no kind of interaction that enables you to have commerce with the human being that you've always known. And there, There it seems to me that for the argument made at the beginning, one does not lift one's hand against this. That it would be a kind of desecration of the being, no matter how reduced. I treat that person, however reduced, as if full. Lots has been lost, but it's not a corpse, and I'm not entitled to treat it as a corpse, and I'm not entitled to make it into a corpse. Certainly, by the way, not in the name of its own dignity. That would be to take degradation and finish the job by making it into nothingness. That's a long question, a kind of philosophical question about how you compare non-life with non-being with being with difficulties, and I'm not going to be able to sort that out as a philosophical matter, but I'm sort of appealing to the kind of intuition about human dignity that I tried to unfold at the beginning and ask, is it really true? And imagine your mother or your father going down the slope to decline. Let me give you an example. And this is slightly out of school, but it's one of the most moving experiences I've had in the last 5 years in Washington. Washington's not a place for moving experiences. But Mrs. Kass and I were invited once to a social function in the White House. I mentioned the location because you'll see the extraordinary character of the story. It was Valentine's Day. There were couples for dinner, and then there was music in the East Room. And invited to this occasion was an African-American composer and pianist. He was introduced by the President of the United States. The man got up and he said, "I always loved Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is my mother's birthday. My mother is 85 years old. She's in a nursing home in North Carolina. Sometimes when I visit her, she recognizes me. Sometimes when I visit her, she doesn't know who I am. But my mother is alive." He sat down and played. And I thought to myself, there's not a colleague of mine on the faculty of the University of Chicago who could say such a thing. Who could say such a thing and who has understood something profound. Watch, people in this room have had, others will, alas, have the experience of watching their loved ones dwindle. And the question is, when you embrace someone for the last time in a very reduced condition, even though many of their powers that you admired are gone, whether you're embracing the same mother or father that you embraced all your life. They can ask you to help them out, but you will not be, you will somehow not be respecting their dignity if you become the agent of their demise. If you have to do it, we talk about sort of excusing it. But to have a kind of doctrine that justifies this as a matter of course seems to me bonkers. Professor Singer, please.
Thank you. There are a number of things I'd like to say. I'll try and confine myself to just two, one factual and one philosophical. You made the claim that legalizing physician-assisted suicide or voluntary euthanasia is bad policy, is dangerous, and you suggested that it leads to a plague, I think you said, in terms of decisions that have to be made towards the end of life. Yesterday you quoted a figure of a third of doctors saying they carried out non-voluntary euthanasia in the Netherlands. I'd like to ask you a couple of things about that. Firstly, do you have any information that a similar question asked of doctors in other countries would yield a lower answer, or that a similar question asked of doctors in the Netherlands before they legalized euthanasia would have resulted in a lower answer? Because I'm not aware of any such information. It's my view that Dutch doctors are rather more direct and honest in answering these questions than doctors in other countries.
I don't have the information. Perhaps there have been studies done in other countries. If the question is, are there doctors doing similar things in other countries without the benefit of protection of the law, the answer is surely yes.
Right. Well, I actually have done a similar survey in Australia with colleagues. We found a higher percentage of doctors in Australia who were prepared to admit, under the protection of anonymity, that they had ended the lives of patients without their consent. So I really don't think you should be quoting those figures as if they reflect badly on the Netherlands if you don't have comparative judgments from other countries.
I'm sorry, but what's impressive, you see, is that the Dutch prided themselves on setting up precisely the safeguards, that there would have to be accurate reporting. There is no accurate reporting. That these conditions, that there would have to be a second opinion. There are no second opinions. That in fact, under no circumstances would there be non-voluntary euthanasia. For people who for people who think that this is a practice which legalization could in fact that you could sort of institute precisely the safeguards that you would like, the Dutch experience is not encouraging. There they've in fact tried to do it in the open with the safeguards, and the safeguards have...
Well, if it's not encouraging, could you explain why it is that the country that presumably understands the Netherlands best, that is Belgium, and I say that because it's not only a neighbour of the Netherlands, but the majority of the population of Belgium speak a language that is so close to Dutch that they read Dutch newspapers and watch Dutch television, why they were the next country to follow the Netherlands and institute a very similar reform?
This could escalate into a large question about what's wrong with Europe. I don't know the answer, but I mean let's not assume that the Europeans may be the wave of the future, and then it would be a long question whether the answer should be hooray or God help us.
Okay, well, let me move on to the philosophical question. You developed an argument about the godlike properties that human beings have that are worthy of respect and dignity and so on. And I don't want to query that many humans have those properties, but having spent some time on that, you then made a move very swiftly, and it seemed to me without any justification, for saying that we should respect not only beings with those properties, but the human form, irrespective of whether it has those properties or not. You said something like pace philosophers of personhood or something, but you didn't explain why the philosophers of personhood got this wrong. And I'd suggest that, while one can see in cases of, say, someone with dementia who's been a person and has lived a life that we might want to honour, I would say that where that has never occurred, where you only have the human form, without there ever having been the qualities of self-awareness, freedom, choice, autonomy, whatever else it might be, that you haven't provided us with any reason as to why we should respect, if you like, the mere shell when we know that the kernel is absent.
Well, first of all, it did go quickly, and I don't think I did simply wave at the other point. I tried to suggest that indeed with the help of that passage and the peculiarity about the way in which on the one hand the reason has to do with the godlikeness, but the injunction has to do with the blood, which is the quote-unquote mere life. The argument was brief, but the suggestion was that these so-called fancy higher powers that we have are held up by, are intimately linked with, and are inseparable from this elaborate construction of digestion, metabolism, etc. And that to respect anything human means respecting the human as it comes, which is as a composite whole, not just a disembodied mind that hitches a ride to this hulk, but is a concretion of lively embodiment. And yes, I don't know which examples you want to give me, whether you want to give me the anencephalic child.
That would be useful, because I think clearly you know, the inseparability goes one way but not the other. Yes, we don't have mind and choice without bodies as far as, you know, we presently can anyway, but we clearly do have the mind and body and the blood separable from, because it's completely absent, the mind and the choice and so on. So let's talk about the anencephalic infant, if you like, as an example.
Yeah, well, that it's a grave misfortune. There's no disagreement that one should not do much to sustain this existence. I wouldn't have any difficulty with that. But do I want to somehow be the judge of saying that what is present here is so monstrously non-human that I can treat it as meat or as natural resource? Is, I think, that is, my inclination here is I'm not sure I can give you a perfect defense of the case which lies on the boundary, but I don't think the boundary case is a real embarrassment to the truth of the position when the light is shining brightly. I would restrain myself at that boundary precisely because I don't trust myself to make the kinds of distinctions that you would like subsequently to make, giving a kind of precise functional account to say how much humanity is here, therefore how much should we continue to do. Let's say it has the human form. It belongs to the species, most of whose members have had, will have this kind of rich gift of a special kind of being, and that we preserve our own dignity by treating the exemplars, even the maimed members, as if they were fully members of our tribe. Maybe that's too generous on our part, but it's a generosity which hurts us not at all.
Well, I don't want to go on too long, but let me just say, if we wanted to respect those who are close to us, maybe we would do better by being generous to those who are close to having the kind of capacities that you and I both think of as important. For example, chimpanzees, who do show some ability to make choices and have close personal relationships with other chimpanzees and so on. They seem to be much closer to us in those capacities than the anencephalic, which is never going to even be able to smile at his or her mother.
I have an enormous regard for chimpanzees and would do nothing to abuse them, but I don't think with all due respect, I don't think that the case for the proper treatment and respect for animals depends upon blurring the line between the human and the animal, or requires that whatever is good for the treatment of us is necessarily to be extended simply to any and all of them. We had some of this discussion before. I think if you read that biblical account, the good Lord is disappointed in Noah. The idea was, in fact, and just as the first creation story, the animals and the human beings were given seed and herb and fruit trees bearing fruit, all of them. They were all supposed to be vegetarian. But that injunction had somehow to be provided because there was a certain tendency in life, in fact, to devour. If you want to say, look, there is a kind of ethical ideal which not only respects human dignity, but extends some of that respect and proper regard to the animal kingdom vastly more than we have, I don't have any quarrel with you. We would then have to probably sit down and see how deep is the agreement, but I don't see any reason why, in order to be a defender of the considerable dignity of chimpanzees, by the way, I'm perfectly willing to speak about that, the nobility of certain animal bearing.
But you wouldn't oppose research on chimpanzees, which the government currently subsidizes, pays for, in the way that you would oppose research on an anencephalic infant, I take it?
Actually, I don't favor research on chimpanzees.
Okay, good. Okay, I'll pass the mic on to someone else. I think I've taken...
Please, I'm sorry.
I'd like to ask you if you see an important moral distinction between assisted suicide and suicide. And let me give an example here. A substantial portion of the Medal of Honor winners during the Second World War were military people, Marines and others, who had essentially committed suicide by putting themselves in a situation where they would almost certainly be killed in order to save the lives of members of their platoon. The Marine who jumps on a live hand grenade, for instance, to protect his fellow Marines. Some people who have terminal illnesses, in order not to avoid a troubling situation for themselves, but a troubling situation for their loved ones, will often commit suicide. Now, it seems to me that that sort of action, if not heroic, at least it's sort of other regarding, and it's something that many of us would consider to have a certain nobility to it. I'm just wondering what your views here on that kind of situation would be.
Thank you very much. I would not describe the first case as suicide. Suicide is when someone puts on the explosives around their waist and walks into a supermarket and blows themselves up and all the other people around them. That's suicide. People who throw themselves on a grenade, you describe that action as that the action takes their life, but the purpose of jumping on that grenade is not to take their life. The purpose of jumping on that grenade is to save the lives of the people around them. And that means, look, all of us spend the coin of our lives some way. The question is, do we spend it in good cause and in the service of something? So this is to place oneself at risk of death, even at high risk of death, even at risk of almost certain death, and yet they're not somehow committing suicide. The other case is more interesting and closer. This is now not about assisted suicide. This is about someone who is clever enough to hoard their own pills, right? And I would say, I think the closest I've ever come, I think, to sort of arguing myself into your position would be something like that. To spare my children of having to tend me, not the burdens of tending me. That I don't necessarily want to spare them. That's part of life. I want to spare them to have to eventually get themselves into a condition where with half their souls they would wish me dead. Not because I'm sorry to be the recipient of such wishes, but I don't want them to have that feeling about their parents. And therefore, if I could somehow prevent that kind of guilt-ridden, horrible desire that one's own source disappear, I could imagine myself slipping out. But then you think about it for a minute. And the only way in which this could be done would be nobody would know that this is a suicide. Nobody could know. Because otherwise, what you're really saying to them is, I don't trust you to be able to care for me in my decline. You know, look, I mean, the survivors of suicide are tortured people, usually. The question is, what did we do that could have produced a different result? And here, in what amounts to being a gift to the children, a thought that being the gift to the children, if you screw it up, it's worse than not having tried it at all. I mean, this would be somehow to treat the taking of one's own life as a kind of generous act. And I think I could understand it, but I suspect that the people who could do this perfectly are very few and far between, and one doesn't want to somehow come around recommending it, because the much more likely thing is people are going to be saying, you know what, they wish me dead anyhow. And the condition of the possibility of caring lovingly for the people who are dear to us is that you do not have flitting across your mind all the time, one option is to help make them dead. That destroys the kind of caring relation. You owe the people in whatever condition they're in the best care that can be given to them as they are here and now. Hard to do, taxing, can be depressing, but that's thrown to us, and we exercise ourselves well or badly by whether we rise to the occasion or not.
Please join us subsequently in a reception in the foyer and join us presently in saying thank you.